Well, the task force will now come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not in the task force are allowed to participate in today's hearing consistent with the committee's practice. This hearing is entitled AI and the Evolution of Cloud Computing, evaluating how financial data is stored, protected, and maintained by cloud providers. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Well, first off, thanks everyone for joining us today in what should be a very interesting hearing of the task force. Today we're looking to explore the rise of cloud computing in the financial services sector, including the opportunities and risks of companies' migration to the cloud, as well as the regulatory framework for protecting sensitive financial information that's stored in the cloud. And I should also mention that it seems possible that we're going to have votes called, floor votes in the House called partway through the hearing. And so in that case, we'll have a game time decision about which members might be interested in reconvening. And if not, we can just convene for a private discussion among the members with, if that turns out to be what's feasible. Cloud computing the transition to cloud computing is something that is a double-edged sword. I faced that personally where several years ago when I couldn't stand it anymore, what was happening in politics, and I went and downloaded TensorFlow to my laptop and worked through the various, this is Google's open source AI engine. And so the trade-offs there were pretty obvious to me, that the data set I wanted to be working on fit on my laptop, but it just wasn't reasonable. The problems of having to reconfigure your system for the latest version of Python, everything like that. So that the advantages of going to a cloud-based system just for a small-scale user are enormous. Not to mention all the defensive things that you get when you go to a competent cloud provider, where the first lines of defense are actually provided by the cloud service. But then when you talk about the policy implications, we're always struggling with data privacy and the basic fact that AI works much better with large data sets. And that has huge policy implications that we're struggling with. If we're not careful, it's going to encourage the consolidation that's already a natural feature of any digital enterprise, which is essentially a natural monopoly. And this AI has a good chance of amplifying this. And if you don't have access to the large data sets, it's hard for a startup to compete. And if they do have access, then there are huge potential of privacy breach. For example, can cause economic damage massively in excess of what what the market capitalization of some little startup. And so we have to be very careful that the AI policies that we apply to the cloud don't further force consolidation in an already consolidated industry. The second thing is just the way that AI will be a continuing attack on privacy. Some of the most competent spear phishing attacks now involve multi-factor attacks where you're using an AI voice synthesizer in concert with a spear phishing attack to make it very likely that an ordinary person will click on the enclosure. And we're seeing, I think it was within the last year, that for the first time, an AI engine competed on a level playing field with teams of hackers in terms of finding software vulnerabilities. So we're talking about a future that is now where both cyber offense and cyber defense are going to be best employed by AI. And these sort of efforts are out of the scale where a small person holding their own computer can actually hope to compete in this world. And so that you're going to be increasingly dependent on large cloud vendors and companies that deploy on the cloud, for the defensive work that you'll have to do. And so that's another huge issue. So anyway, I don't want to take up a lot of time here. I'd like to get to the witness's testimony as much as possible, and I just want to thank you all for appearing, and now I'll turn it over to the acting ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing today and generally for pulling this task force together. If I had known a task force on artificial intelligence was a possibility, someone like myself might have run for Congress much sooner in life. So it's great to be here. And to our witnesses, I look forward to hearing each of your testimonies and appreciate you being here. Cloud services offer many benefits both to financial institutions and consumers. And has been discussed by Ranking Member Hill and others, the work this committee is doing through both the FinTech and AI task forces is exploring ways to streamline compliance, lower regulatory costs, and also deliver an overall better and more affordable experience for American consumers. By utilizing the cloud, companies can do just that, help the consumer. Financial institutions are able to innovate and thrive in an environment that affords both scalability and flexibility. There are, however, some risks when dealing with anything new, including technology and operations, which we look forward to discussing further in today's hearing. In less than a century, computing has revolutionized the banking industry along with the types and delivery of financial products and services that can be offered. Today, we all know that a majority of banking and personal finance is handled either on your phone or on a computer. But it hasn't always been that way. Banks first started using computers in the 1950s predominantly to process checks and later electronic funds transfers. Since banks first began to use computers, they have relied on a secure information technology infrastructure run by non-bank companies or third-party service providers or TSPs. In the 1980s and 1990s, banks started to use personal computers for their employees. By the end of the 20th century, a greater proportion of workers in finance used computers than in any other industry. Then comes the internet, and everything changed, especially in banking. I say all of this to show that the financial industry has a long history of utilizing computers, and now they are outsourcing many of those responsibilities to the cloud, which is why I'm glad we're having this hearing today. It's of the utmost importance to ensure all of these operations supported by the cloud are safe, secure, and private for its customers. We have all heard about the Capital One breach that happened this past summer, and that breach was connected to AWS, the bank's cloud service provider. Our job in Congress is to ensure that financial institutions of all sizes, their third-party service providers, and every other entity involved in the chain has legislative or regulatory certainty to do what is needed to protect consumers' data. If you look at the Treasury's FinTech report last year on non-banks and FinTechs, you will see a recommendation that federal regulators ease the adoption of new technologies such as cloud computing with the aim of reducing barriers to the migration of activities to the cloud. I agree we need to ensure innovation is not stifled because innovation is ultimately what protects consumers while also providing more options and more choices. So all that to say, I look forward to constructive dialogue today. I hope we can find solutions that promote innovation while also ensuring consumer safety. Today's hearing is a start of what I expect will be a longer conversation involving identity, privacy, and consumer safety. So I look forward to ongoing discussions as our world only becomes more connected. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And today we're welcoming the testimony of Meredith Broussard, Associate Professor at NYU and Affiliate Faculty Member at the NYU Center for Data Science. Alla Seiffert, Director of Cloud Policy and Counsel at the Internet Association. Steve Grobman, Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at McAfee. And Dr. Jordan Brandt, CEO and co-founder of Inpher. And Paul Benda, the Senior Vice President, Risk and Cybersecurity Policy at the American Bankers Association. Witnesses remind that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written testimony will be made part of the permanent record. Ms. Broussard, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Congressman Foster and Acting Ranking Member Grobman, thank you very much. Members of the committee, it is an honor to be asked to testify today. I'm a professor at NYU, a computer scientist turned journalist, and the author of a book called Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. I'd like to speak today about the realities of AI and cloud computing as a way of thinking through the human scale issues with running bank operations in the cloud. Computer scientists like to say the cloud is someone else's computer, and we know exactly where those computers are. Amazon Web Services controls 48% of the cloud computing market, and it has 4 major data centers or server farms in the United States. They're large, usually windowless buildings in Northern Virginia, Ohio, Oregon, and Northern California. Worldwide, 76% of the cloud market is controlled by a few big firms: Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Alibaba. Inside their server farm buildings, these companies maintain thousands of physical computers that anyone can rent space on. including banks. The US government is a cloud client. The AWS GovCloud is a secure set of servers that host data and programs for DHS, Treasury, DoD, Cloud.gov, and other agencies. The computers that power the AWS GovCloud are physically located in Amazon's building in Virginia and backed up on the West Coast. Running bank operations in the cloud means moving bank operations to one of these buildings, which are vulnerable to a variety of physical or cybersecurity threats. Again, the reality there is market dominance. We should ask, does it make sense to have all of the defense programs and all of the Citibank and Chase and SoftBank data stored in the same Amazon building in Northern Virginia? Let's also think about the people in the banking and cloud computing ecosystem. It helps to hear from the IT professionals who manage local and cloud computers. A 2014 Ponemon Institute survey asked IT professionals to rate their organization's effectiveness in securing data and applications used in the cloud. 51% rated their organizations as low in effectiveness. They said the likelihood of a data breach in the cloud is increased. 69% believed that their organizations failed to be proactive in assessing information that was too sensitive to be stored in the cloud. If IT professionals have so little faith in their own organizations, and we know there is a high demand but low supply of IT professionals who are experts in cybersecurity, it seems that more regulation and oversight will help protect bank operations in the cloud. I want to talk now about AI. Artificial intelligence is widely misunderstood. Hollywood images of AI, like the Terminator or Commander Data from Star Trek, are what most people think of when they think of AI. And these Hollywood images are delightful, but they're not real. AI is best understood as a branch of computer science, the same way that algebra is a branch of mathematics. Inside AI, there are other branches: machine learning, expert systems, natural language processing. There are just a few of them. But machine learning is the most popular kind of AI in business right now. And it's so popular that there's been linguistic confusion. When people say, I am using AI for my business, usually what they mean is, I am using machine learning for my business. And machine learning is another misleading name. It sounds like the computer has sentience or agency. It's learning like a human being, and it does not. Machine learning is math. It's computational statistics on steroids. And banks are using machine learning to help make business decisions about things like who qualifies for a mortgage. But one problem is that machine learning models discriminate by default. Let's say that I have a data set of people who have gotten mortgages in the past. The data will be tainted by the history of redlining and residential segregation in the United States. If I build a machine learning model based on this data, the model will discriminate against citizens. We need to audit the AI algorithms and machine learning models used by banks and other types of companies for fairness and to prevent discrimination. The issue here is not where these AI programs run, or whether the data is stored on bank computers or on Amazon's computers. Instead, we should ask what the AI is used for, plus how it is used, what kind of AI is used, what specific data is used to train a machine learning model, what specific data is used to make decisions after the model is trained. One option is that these kinds of questions could be answered in plain language, and this information could be communicated as part of the regulatory examination. The final thing I'll mention is the cultural conflict between tech and finance. In the tech world, nobody talks about regulatory compliance or teaches it much in schools. The move fast and break things ethos is diametrically opposed to the mindset of compliance. It doesn't surprise me that in April 2019, when federal examiners visited the AWS site in Virginia, they didn't notice the Capital One data breach.
Thank you. And I guess at this point, we're on a tight time scale,
Okay,
so we'll,
sorry.
so the members can read your full written
All right,
testimony.
thank you for the opportunity to contribute, and I look forward to answering your questions.
All right, thank you. And now, Ms. Seiffert, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Foster, Acting Ranking Member Riggleman, and distinguished members of the task force. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the use of cloud in financial services. My name is Alla Seiffert, and I'm the Director of Cloud Policy and Counsel at Internet Association. Internet Association, or IA, represents over 40 of the world's leading internet companies. Our members are global leaders in the drive to develop lower cost, more secure, scalable, elastic, efficient, resilient, and innovative cloud services to customers in both the private and public sectors. All of the major US-based hyperscale cloud service providers are members of IA. I'd like to thank Chairman Foster, the task force leadership, and your staff for your continued commitment to exploring emerging areas around cloud computing and AI within financial services. I'd like to start with a background on cloud. NIST defines cloud computing as a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. Cloud service providers, or CSPs, make available to customers a wide range of services that function as IT building blocks that customers can use to build applications to meet their IT goals and be more secure, innovative, and responsive to their customers. Cloud is flexible enough to be used for everything from storing national security data to managing my PayPal balance. Security is the top priority for CSPs, and they invest a tremendous amount to make their services secure. By using cloud services, customers such as financial institutions can focus on carrying out their core business functions and benefit from the security measures that CSPs have in place. In that way, the cloud is kind of like an office building landlord. It'll rent you space and make sure you have doors that lock, but it's ultimately your responsibility to decide who you let into your office for meetings. Consequently, financial institutions remain accountable for managing the risk of their IT environments, whether they're run in-house, through a third-party managed service provider, or through a CSP. Today, financial institutions use the cloud for a wide range of applications, from storing publicly available data or running test environments to creating digital channels, storing sensitive records, or running critical workloads. We have the following three major themes to discuss with the task force today. First, cloud implementation is a shared responsibility between CSPs and customers. Financial institutions that use cloud computing operate in an environment where they manage certain aspects of their IT resources and are responsible for configuring those resources, but they rely on the CSP to manage the cloud itself. This division of labor means that both the CSP and the customer bear responsibility for making sure services are run efficiently and securely. Because each party is responsible for securing the resources they control, security in the cloud is something we call a shared responsibility. Simply put, CSPs are responsible for security of the cloud, while the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. CSPs provide a broad range of information, tools, and assistance to help customers with these responsibilities. Second, cloud adoption increases cybersecurity. This is because embracing cloud technology helps banks increase overall security by modernizing applications and gaining better visibility into their networks, traffic, and vulnerabilities. The opportunities offered by cloud computing enable enterprises to level up their IT security posture and implement best-in-class cybersecurity solutions. Large cloud providers have the resources and expertise to invest in and maintain state-of-the-art and comprehensive IT security and deploy it on a global basis across all their platforms. Financial institutions, particularly small and mid-sized firms, could find it economically infeasible to achieve several similar levels of security on their own. Third, cloud increases the resilience of our nation's financial institutions. Specifically, it allows firms of all sizes to leverage a suite of best-in-class tools for backup, security, and continuity of operations. CSPs design their infrastructure to be resilient to outages and incidents, and customers can take advantage of this infrastructure to architect for enhanced operational resilience. Since CSPs can rapidly redistribute data across geographically diverse storage regions, cloud environments can enhance firms' strategies for business continuity and operational resilience. In conclusion, I'd like to reiterate IA's gratitude for being included in discussions with the committee task force on AI and for the opportunity to testify today. IA, along with our member companies, stands ready to support the task force and committee in helping financial services companies adopt cloud in a secure way. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Beautifully timed. Thank you. Mr. Grobman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Foster, Acting Ranking Member Riggleman, and members of the task force. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about two important issues for the financial services sector, cloud and artificial intelligence. Both have advantages to the industry and raise security concerns. Financial service organizations are migrating to the cloud to reduce complexity, cut costs, and focus their capabilities on delivering financial services to their customers. By using cloud, both large and small institutions benefit from advanced technology that normally is available only to those who can invest significantly in highly technical workforce. Cloud providers also generally practice strong cyber hygiene, enabling quick response to vulnerabilities and issues. Yet there are also security challenges in moving to the cloud. As cloud providers service many clients, a breach can place multiple organizations' data at risk. An analogy I like to use is that traditional on-premise computing is like an automobile, and cloud computing is a lot like an airplane. While an airplane is safer than an automobile given its more advanced technology, when a failure does occur, the impact can be catastrophic. Today, almost all organizations, including financial services, use multiple cloud providers, a trend that is leaving organizations with less visibility to their operations. To remediate the situation, organizations need solutions to manage visibility and monitor security between cloud service consumers and providers. Known as CASB, this function is a critical new class of application that's rapidly being adopted to manage and secure diverse cloud environments. Another security issue is the use of unauthorized cloud applications by employees, what we call shadow IT. This creates risk for both the technology and the data. Like cloud, we must understand the capabilities, limitations, and risks of AI. Financial service organizations are using AI and machine learning to enable advanced analytics that allow them to better service and protect customers and better manage overall costs. AI is also the new foundation of cyber defense, enabling us to better detect threats and find the so-called needle in a haystack of needles. AI-based automation is helping us alleviate the cybersecurity talent shortage, enabling us to free up human security professionals to focus on the most critical aspects of cyber defense. But AI is actually quite fragile. In many industries that use AI, such as meteorology, where an adversary does not exist, the fragility is not an issue. In cybersecurity, adversaries are building techniques to confuse AI models and evade detection. To mitigate these risks, McAfee is investing in understanding the adversarial techniques and researching ways to make AI more resilient against attacks. AI can also be used as a tool by the adversaries. Bad actors can use AI to identify the most vulnerable victims, automate phishing, and evade detection. AI improves their ability to execute attacks and enables content creation for use in social engineering and information warfare, such as deepfake videos. These and many other adversarial uses of AI can and will occur, putting our financial services sector, as well as our democracy and civil society, at increased risk. Most major financial institutions are prepared for major cyber attacks, in part due to the regulatory oversight of the Bank Service Company Act, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. Financial service organizations also actively engage in cyber sharing groups in collaboration with DHS, the OCC, and the Federal Reserve. Likewise, overall, the largest third-party cloud providers also have strong cybersecurity records. They have solid plans in place to respond to cyber attacks. They're committed to aligning with the NIST cybersecurity framework, and they're active in public-private partnerships. Cloud providers are less regulated than their counterparts in the financial services sector, as many policymakers know that overly prescriptive regulation would stifle innovation in technology companies and could quickly be outdated as technology advances. Yet federal regulators do have a legitimate interest in seeing that IT and cybersecurity services provided by cloud providers to financial institutions are robust. To best secure cloud and AI technology in the financial services sector, we recommend voluntary collaboration and the use of industry-supported standards and best practices, such as the NIST cybersecurity framework. When appropriate, existing cybersecurity rules for highly regulated critical infrastructure industries should be updated to reflect the rapid speed of innovation. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Again, beautifully timed. And Dr. Brandt, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, Acting Ranking Member Riggleman, and members of the task force. And Chairman Foster, I have to say it's impressive that you've experimented with TensorFlow, so thank you for your efforts. Cloud computing and AI are distinct and complementary technologies that offer tremendous economic and consumer benefits. The cloud reduces cost and democratizes access to computational resources, which in turn powers AI to streamline business functions and provide new insights that improve consumer welfare. The committee has correctly identified that these benefits must be harnessed with proper legislative and technological safeguards for both data security and privacy. Whereas cloud computing and AI pose distinct risks, a common theme applies to both. Don't put all of your eggs into one basket. The consolidation of sensitive personal information into any individual entity to be mined by data-hungry AI algorithms poses significant economic risks and an existential threat to the privacy of our citizens. Fortunately, the emergence of privacy-enhancing technologies, or PETs, and specifically encryption and use capabilities can address the concerns of both cloud data security and privacy in AI. As banks move more of their data and information processing to the cloud, they are effectively consolidating risk into a select few providers of cloud computing infrastructure. The magnitude of this risk was underscored by the recent Capital One hack. The breach could have been prevented by securely computing across distributed data in a multi-cloud architecture, in which data is processed without exposing the underlying personal information. This would have eliminated a single point of failure. To illustrate how this works, it is important to firstly define the three pillars of encryption, which is the best mathematical safeguard of data. Firstly, we have encryption in transit, which secures the transmission between the sender and the receiver. Secondly, encryption at rest, which secures data storage while it's sitting on a hard disk. Thirdly, we have encryption in use, such as homomorphic encryption and multi-party computation, which secures data in memory while it is being processed. In-transit and at-rest encryption are already ubiquitous. Encryption in use is rapidly evolving from academic research into practical applications today, as its computing performance for large data sets quantifiably improves. For example, at Inpher, we have made multiple order of magnitude improvements in the performance of both homomorphic encryption and multi-party computation without compromising accuracy. We're currently deploying this technology to solve real-world privacy and security challenges in banking, defense, healthcare, and other industries. Our platform keeps data private, secure, and resident, precluding the need to centralize information into a single repository. This proactive safeguard enables financial institutions to minimize risk and leverage the full benefits of AI without a privacy trade-off. PETs thus internalize the letter and the spirit of US and international data privacy regimes which jointly emphasize privacy by design. Specifically, in the financial services sector, we are witnessing the application of PETs in fraud and anti-money laundering, credit scoring, trade surveillance, and all forms of predictive modeling where compliant data sharing is critical. PETs safely overcome data silos and increase data utility. Regulators and law enforcement also benefit from privacy-preserving computing, as they are able to run forensics and surveillance on encrypted data for pattern matching and event detection without compromising individual privacy or inviting potential liability. They can find the bad guys without compromising honest citizens. To this end, we have briefed many domestic and international regulators about these capabilities over the last year, and we are encouraged by their enthusiastic support. To conclude, as a nation, we are in a technology arms race with countries like China that do not share our views on individual rights. We must not accept the false dichotomy between AI and our privacy. We can have both. Privacy-preserving computing not only champions and achieves this outcome, but also fosters new innovation and economic expansion that benefits our government, industry, and every American citizen. We truly appreciate your interest and desire to learn more about this very complex topic, and we remain at your disposal for any further questions that you may have.
Thank you. And Mr. Benda, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Foster, Acting Ranking Member Riggleman, and distinguished members of the task force. I appreciate the opportunity to come before you today to discuss how financial data is stored, protected, and maintained by cloud providers. My name is Paul Benda, and I'm a Senior Vice President for Risk and Cybersecurity Policy at the American Bankers Association. Prior to joining the ABA, I served in the government both in the Air Force and as a civilian in the Department of Defense and Homeland Security, where I focused on research and development of new technologies to protect against kinetic and cyber threats. After I transitioned to the private sector, I focused on assessing physical and cybersecurity practices of businesses and recommending improvements to make them more secure. At the ABA, my portfolio is on physical and cybersecurity policy. helping our members understand emerging threats, new technologies, and the political and legislative environments surrounding their use. The ABA believes the flexibility, scalability, and advanced technologies available in the cloud make it a valuable tool for financial institutions to consider using. We appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts on how financial data is stored and protected in the cloud, and would like to highlight 4 main points. First, banks are responsible for their data. Title V of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, has long established standards that require a bank to take meaningful steps designed to ensure the security and confidentiality of its customers' information. These requirements are in place regardless of whether that information is stored on-premise, by a third party, or in the cloud. Regardless of the location, banks are responsible for ensuring that data is protected. Second, the cloud offers benefits, but risks must be managed. It is clear that there are potential benefits as well as risks regarding use of the cloud, but the decision on its use should be left to each individual bank, as each bank is different and is most capable of performing an overall risk-benefit calculation for their environment. If done appropriately, the use of the cloud is likely to have no adverse effect on the overall risk profile of a bank and would most likely improve their resiliency. Third, all parties should collaborate to improve cloud security and efficiency. Banks inhabit a unique regulatory space. No other industry has the level of regulator guidance, oversight, or examination structure in place to ensure that financial data is protected. The baseline shared responsibility model of security used by CSPs attempts to shift all responsibility for information security to its customers. Although many CSPs do offer to manage certain IT controls on behalf of their customers, which can blur the lines of responsibility. We believe it would be helpful, especially for financial data deployments, that a transparent set of unified security controls be developed, that security control responsibilities are clearly delineated for each deployment, and that a process for CSPs to notify customers of potential security misconfigurations in their cloud deployments be instituted. This cooperative approach to security would increase overall security of the data and aid in the management of this critical data as it resides in the public cloud. We would welcome a discussion between banks, cloud service providers, and regulators that would allow us to work in a collaborative manner to ensure that the right frameworks, processes, and programs are in place to allow adoption of these new technologies while maintaining the safety and soundness of the financial institution. Fourth, regulatory clarity is important. From a financial services perspective, the GLBA, Bank Services Company Act, and banking agency guidance already provide a robust regulatory framework to oversee bank utilization of the cloud. But additional clarity would be helpful on the roles and responsibility of regulators with respect to their direct oversight of cloud service providers. We believe that the oversight authorities in the Bank Services Company Act could be aligned and coordinated with the proposed set of unified security controls for financial data deployed in the cloud so that banks could clearly understand those areas where they could depend on regulators to provide oversight of the cloud service providers and where banks must utilize private sector methods to ensure that appropriate due diligence is done. A clear delineation of roles and responsibilities that is arrived at in a collaborative manner would improve overall security as well as efficiencies in the oversight process for banks of all sizes. The challenges in this space are complex. We believe that every stakeholder wants to ensure that security of these critical systems is maintained, and at the same time, innovation is not hindered. A collaborative approach that merges the best of the safety and soundness culture of banks and the regulators with the entrepreneurial spirit of cloud service providers is likely to achieve a lasting outcome that is acceptable to all parties. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Now I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Our witnesses here seem to have identified 4 lines of defense, really, here. The first line of defense that Ms. Seiffert mentioned was just that cloud service providers have multiple physical locations. And so when you're talking about physical attacks, that's a pretty solid strategy. The second one is that I guess Mr. Grobman mentioned, the use of multiple cloud providers. And I'd be interested, I'll be asking questions on whether that's, how realistic a possibility that is. The third one is advanced encryption techniques as a way to be able to survive even a significant cyber breach. And then the fourth general thing is just the future of AI as the main tool that will be used for real-time cyber defense. And so I'm starting with the first point. Ms. Seiffert, to what extent is having multiple physical locations a real protection, And to what extent could it be illusory that if you have a shared hardware vulnerability, for example, if you lose your hardware root of trust, the key used to download software updates, for example, and if that gets corrupted or lost or the bad guys get their whole, you could be in a situation where, yeah, we have multiple locations, but because of a shared hardware vulnerability or a silicon bug that's discovered. So can you say a little bit about that, whether that's going to prove illusory or not?
Thank you for your question. That is, without a doubt, a possibility, but nevertheless, the multiple availability zone architecture of cloud computing really does lead to significant increases in resiliency. There are a number of ways to configure cloud-native applications with respect to the failover mechanism. I think your point is incredibly valid. What if a vulnerability exists upon multiple availability zones? But it's my understanding that there is a way to architect applications such that in order to have backup and redundancy, storage, and essentially seamless failover in the event of issues in one location.
Let's see, the question of whether multiple cloud providers are also a realistic, useful defense. That's something that Congress, for example, could mandate for too big to fail banks, that they simply maintain a hot spare provider in addition to the hot spares that are provided internal to each cloud service provider. And I was wondering if anyone, Mr. Grobman or Mr. Benda, might have a comment on that, where obviously that would impose costs. And,
Sure.
and we struggle with this all the time in this committee, is the trade-off between short-term profitability and reducing tail risk.
I think in general, having diverse implementations can add some additional levels of security, but we also need to recognize that a lot of the issues here are not new. In your last question, you pointed out that a single technical vulnerability could impact multiple physical locations. That's true regardless of whether it's a cloud or a traditional on-premise implementation. I think similarly, if you look at multiple cloud providers, there are going to be some issues that are cloud provider specific and some that would be at an application level or really not matter whether or not it had multiple providers. So I think it is going to add some help, but not be the silver bullet solution.
Yeah, I mean, like the meltdown inspector bugs, for example, applied to multiple processor architectures, so that even having a separate set of processes your cloud's running on was not necessarily a defense.
Correct. I do think that particular issue is illustrative of how effective the large cloud providers are at remediating vulnerabilities. All of the large cloud providers patched their hardware with new firmware literally within days, whereas we've seen private data centers usually take many weeks, if not months, to get those same patches.
Okay. Now, in terms of advanced encryption techniques, Mr. Brandt, Dr. Brandt, you said that you'd made big improvements in the speed, and I guess you probably have competitors in this. If you look at the overall trajectory of performance of privacy-preserving computing, is there a way to estimate the point at which it might be a pretty small overhead for things like training neural networks and so on?
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, there's been drastic improvements over the last several years, orders of magnitude improvements that we've seen in the performance of encryption in use specifically. So again, keeping data encrypted while it's being processed, which can also help protect against these hardware vulnerabilities. If you focus on the data itself, even if the hardware is compromised, the data itself would be secure. Of course, the trade-off has been higher computational overhead to achieve this. With the current trajectory, we're seeing that large data sets to be used for training neural networks or training AI models in general is becoming quite practical, especially because that's an offline process. It doesn't need to be done necessarily in real time. So even if you're talking about an order of magnitude higher compute overhead than you would have in plain text, it still can be used.
Now, unfortunately, I must bring the gavel down on myself and recognize my colleague, Mr. Regelman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to the witnesses. And I first want to thank Ms. Broussard for your definition on AI and ML. That is an argument I have had in the DoD, I think, for the past 5 years. So I appreciate that before we get started. Now, we've had a few hearings here in Congress, and we have a lot of things here. I want to make sure we get to our colleagues. So I've written down, you were talking about, the chairman was talking about the 4 issues that he saw here. I have some specific questions just based on my background in not really cloud computing, but trying to do the governance and security, overseeing cloud computing in the DoD, specifically the challenges with competition amongst cloud computing and the fun that we've had there with security, but also the regulatory issues. So, and I want to start with Mr. Grobman, and I'm going to go with Mr. Benda. We were talking about continuity of operations, I think, a little bit earlier is where how I would look at it. And this is something that I'm looking at as we're going forward. Do you think would COOP, continuity of operations, do you think would be less expensive, right, with cloud applications, even based on scalability, which I'll go to Mr. Benda about. But do you think actually when you're looking at the cloud and where we're going right now, do you believe that would be less expensive for continuity of operations going forward rather than saying on-premise?
Yes, and the reason is cloud operators are able to execute at scale and be able to have expertise in specific areas that would not be practical at the typical institutions that use them. So for the financial services sector or the DoD to have the same level of competence in the low-level capabilities a CSP has would not be practical. So I think it does make things work a lot faster.
It's interesting because I always, we talked about data stovepipes beforehand, before, cloud computing became a thing, right? And it almost, my worry is creating funnel clouds of excellence also, right, which we called them. But, talking about that, we talked about cost and scalability and talking about continuity of operations and going into Mr. Benda. And sorry, I'm off script right now, so we're having fun right now. So talking about scalability, would you say maybe that it improves, and going on Mr. Grobman, would you say it would improve, right, our security posture based on the fact it could be less expensive based on cloud computing to have more continuity of operations as far as cost and scalability?
So I think that the value of the cloud is certainly the pay-as-you-go model. So you pay for what you use. The scalability is there, and that the clouds have several server farms that you can access and provide you failover capabilities that are in there. So I think the cost process or the cost model is that you're not. The way I've heard it described, it's an operational expense versus capital expense. So the clouds take on that capital expense. It should reduce costs overall and provide a better resilience capability because that scalability is there on an instant, and that's when you pay for it.
I mean, if we're becoming increasingly reliant on technologies, why do you think at this time anybody would wait to adopt them?
I think there is, if you look at from a financial services perspective, there's multiple reasons. One, the cloud is new. You have to learn a whole new set of things on how to secure it. It can be more secure. It can be less secure, depending on how well you know it. The other thing is I think there is a lack of regulatory clarity on how the cloud is treated and how it's examined. It's a real issue for banks, and I think the Treasury report that you referenced there makes some really good recommendations.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Seiffert, the same question sort of you. Do you think there's an ability for any scalable pricing that targets smaller institutions? And I think, and this is what I get excited about a little bit, is that when we're looking at smaller institutions trying to enter into the cloud computing space, do you think that scalable pricing is there based on the fact that we have a better way of doing business, we think, by the way, we think better than on-premise?
Thank you for the question. Small and mid-sized institutions have absolutely the ability to really leverage the power of the cloud to save money, as well as really piggyback on a fair amount of cybersecurity know-how that the cloud service providers bring to the table. A smaller mid-sized institution, credit union in Texas, a small bank in Missouri, they're really not able to retain the level of staff or technical know-how to keep their systems as secure as the cloud service providers are able to keep their infrastructure. And so to that respect, the consumption-based pricing model really favors smaller institutions because their compute spend is just going to be less. It's also going to be more predictable than needing to not only buy a data center, but also patch it to include with the vulnerabilities that were mentioned earlier.
So this allows me to mention everybody. So piggybacking off Dr. Brandt and then going to Mr. Benda, when you're talking about technology, right, and the advances that we had, and going to Mr. Benda and seeing everything that's happening in the last 25 seconds here. Yes, sir, I see the gavel ready. In the last 25 seconds, are we to a point where really it isn't about location anymore, it's about access, right? And if we're to that point right now, should we be more aggressive in making sure that our regulatory structure supports that?
I would agree. I think it is about access, but we have to make sure that those physical security controls are in place, and I think it's really where regulators can help.
Thank you, and I yield my time. You guys were wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses today. And First, let me say that I still don't have clarity. I think it's a little cloudy in my head as to exactly what the real challenges are here. And I'm concerned more about the consumer, perhaps a consumer like myself, that still keeps a checkbook, that doesn't trust a lot of online banking or online shopping, because I find a lot of mistakes even in some of my credit card statements. So the very idea of somewhere in Never Never Land, there's a cloud taking care of my financial information has made me even more nervous today than I was before. And Ms. Let's see, is it Ms. Seiffert? You said there was a shared responsibility, that security in the cloud was the responsibility of the customer financial institution, and security of the cloud was the CSP. What does that really mean?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. What that means is there are a variety of services that are available for banks to configure.
No, I know that, but can you give me an example of what you mean of the difference between of the cloud and in the cloud?
Absolutely.
Something that the person like me that's watching us today can really understand.
Absolutely. So when it comes to the software, whereas you pull up your phone and you have your banking application there, when it is your time to log in, you enter your username and your password. Maybe there's a two-factor authentication. The security of the application, as it communicates with the data that is possibly stored in the cloud, it is your bank's responsibility to make sure that application is secure. So you as a consumer, you're seeing an application. That's all the financial
So
service.
if I don't use my phone for banking, I don't have to worry about this cloud business?
Not quite.
Okay.
So it depends on what
Again, remember, you're talking to a consumer who
That's right.
doesn't do online banking.
Let's say you.
But you've got my data over there in West
That's
Virginia, in the same place where the FBI has a data center, and that makes me nervous too.
Well, it is a very secure data center. It's sort of the physical security of the data center. Who's allowed to get in? You and I probably can't just walk into some data center and have a look around just because we would like to. And the security, the physical security of data centers is a cloud service provider responsibility. The specific application data that's stored there, let's say that you are accessing a loan through a bank. Let's say you go in person to a bank branch in order to apply for a loan. The security of the application, let's say they take down your data on a website or on some sort of document and they email it for processing. The security of that is the bank's responsibility.
Okay. Well, it's a little cloudy, okay? But I'll move on to Ms. Broussard. Do you agree with this shared responsibility? Because I think you said that no one in tech thinks about regulatory issues, and instead they want to move fast and break things. And so if my data is, as a consumer, is stolen or misused, should the liability fall on the CSP or on the financial institution that's using the CSP?
Thank you for the question. The issue of liability is a really good one. We can think about shared responsibility and we can think about shared liability. So for example, if you go to a hotel and you are injured at a hotel because of something that the hotel did, then the hotel bears some responsibility, right? So the best way to think about cybersecurity issues and issues of liability in the computational world is to think about the equivalence in the real world and think through how things would proceed in that way. And specifically in this case, we do have a communication issue, a really major communication issue around compliance and around tech, because AI issues are very difficult to understand, and bank regulatory issues are pretty hard to understand if you're not trained in it. So one of the things that I think we need better training for cloud computing staff about bank regulatory issues, and we need better communication by by both parties about what are the regulations and what is actually happening on the digital side and how is everybody staying protected.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here today for this important task force hearing. I want to start with some questions for Mr. Benda. So you spoke about a collaborative approach between the CSPs, the regulators, and the banks to provide clarity and guidance on rules and responsibilities. I agree, that makes total sense. We need to have this sort of collaboration right now. There's sort of this finger-pointing thing going on, which I think everybody really loves. Not to put you on the spot here, but as you think through that from your perspective, what do you think the right roles and responsibilities for each of those three entities should be?
Well, that you know,
It's a big question, I know.
That is
but
a big
Give me
question.
some broad brushstrokes if you could.
the one thing I would say on that, you know, the banks are comfortable and understand the requirements of GLBA and their responsibility to be overall the caretaker of that customer's data. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year to make sure that happens. We are not interested in offloading that responsibility. When we look at the different roles, we think there is for better term, a clash of culture, that safety and soundness regulatory compliance culture that banks have versus move fast, break things on the tech side. We would love to see more of a more efficient examination process that allows banks to operate and utilize and take advantage of all the wonderful things that the cloud can provide, but then the regulators have their role of, you know, instead of having 5,000 banks go and hit Amazon for a certain thing, we rely on the regulators to look at the physical security access point. We look at them for those things where where there's a multi-tenant cloud, the regulators have access that they need to ensure that the bank's due diligence for that third-party oversight is done, and the banks do their appropriate role. I think working in a collaborative manner, we can make things better for everyone and make things more secure.
And then, as a follow-up, what is the barrier to having that sort of collaboration, and how can we as Congress make sure that actually occurs? Because it strikes me that would be a more effective means than what we're doing now.
Well, I think the Treasury report that Congressman Riggle mentioned actually has this exact recommendation in it. I would just ask for an update from Treasury on where they stand on that, and we are happy to work together with the regulators to make that happen.
Great. And then, Ms. Broussard, your analogy of the hotel, and this could be for anybody, but the analogy of the hotel suggests that, or implies that it's easy to make attribution, right? If it's something that the hotel was deficient in and I get hurt, that's on the hotel. If it's something that I'm doing myself, that's probably on me, and that makes sense. My question with respect to security in the cloud, how easy is it to make those attributions, and does that prevent any sort of barrier?
Thank you for the question. I use the analogy of the hotel because when you go into a hotel, you're renting space.
Right.
And in the cloud environment, you're also renting space from one of the cloud providers. As far as how easy it is to figure out what went wrong, it really depends on the individual situation. Sometimes sometimes it's quite obvious. Like somebody forgot to patch a security hole and a hacker got in through that security hole and it's a well understood breach. Other times we have folks who are really, really creative about finding ways in, and so we have a new kind of breach, an unknown, if you will, and we don't have ways to predict that because it hasn't happened yet. And AI is especially not helpful in that regard because AI can help us protect against things that have already happened, that are known, but it can't be creative in the same way that humans are creative. So this is one of the things that's hard about cybersecurity is you always have to keep up.
Thank you. Mr. Grobman?
So, Representative, I really think it's very similar to in the physical world that in order to have safe use of technology, it's a combination of the technology and the use. So, for example, in order to safely drive a car, having safety features in the car is a critical component, but as a driver, you also need to apply the rules of the road. So if you're in an auto accident, it could be either because of a failure of the automobile or you did something improper as a driver. And it's very much the same in the world of cloud in that we do need to recognize the underlying technology can have vulnerabilities, but also the users of that technology can have misconfigurations or make other mistakes that would lead to issues.
Yeah, and I agree. I guess the point I'm trying to drive home is, so we get the clear rules of the road, we get the guidelines, we make sure that everything's right. I still think we have this attribution question that I'm not sure that we have a great answer for right now. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. And the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all so much. So it strikes me that the thing that makes cloud computing so awesome is its strength is its weakness, right? You've got all of this organized data that you can access remotely, which means that if I'm going to wear a black hat and find a place to target, that's a lot more attractive than getting onto my little laptop. The issues, and as Congresswoman Garcia raised, is this gap between there's who bears the liability for that, and then there's separately who bears the cost, which is not always the same and sometimes don't tie out. So my first question for Mr. Benda is, let's say you are a major U.S. bank. You have customer data from all 50 states within your system. Jurisdictionally, how many different jurisdictions constrain how you regulate the data? Is it 51? Is there one overarching jurisdiction that sets what kind of constraints you have to impose or liabilities you have to manage to?
There can be. A national bank like that is chartered by the OCC. That's the primary regulator. They would have the overarching control or regulation of that. What we would like to see is a harmonization of those regulations. We'd like to see that we don't have to answer to 51 different masters, that we harmonize those regulations through a federal regulator.
Are the obligations substantively different between the states and the feds and in between the states?
They can be, sir.
What if you have international clients, or one of your clients has a London account in addition to your U.S. account that's managed in your same system?
Large banks have a lot of regulatory oversight and a lot of different challenges they have to face. Those are real issues that we work through every day, and we do our best to address them as best we can.
So, given different liabilities for those different jurisdictions, to what degree do the banks segment the data? So in other words, if I have data that's only subject to my London account, is that on the same network and the same accessible server as the one that's my Arkansas account?
That's a great question, sir. I would have to get back to you on that. I don't know a specific implementation on how they would handle that.
Is it even possible to do that segmentation if your customer in Arkansas also has a London account?
Per customer, that's a great question, sir. I don't know the ins and outs of that. I would have to get back to you on that.
So, Ms. Broussard, you seem like a nice person, but I'm going to pretend you've got a black hat now.
Okay.
If you have all of these different regulations, and you have a gap between the liability and the cost of who bears liability and who bears cost between the cloud provider and the bank and the customer whose data is stored, in different international and state and federal rules, where are the regulatory gaps? If you're going to hack into that system and say, where would I exploit the vulnerabilities? Because given your brain power, if you can say we're the black hat, and then we can think about where we ought to be bolstering the defenses. And I'm going to put you on the spot, but I'd love your thoughts.
I actually think about this a lot. As a data journalist, one of the things you do is you look for where can things go wrong, and you look for the things that go wrong. So thank you for the question. I would say that cybersecurity is very important to consider holistically. We need to consider the attack surfaces in the real world as well as the virtual world. As far as who bears the responsibility, this is such a complicated question, and I've talked about it with a lot of lawyers, and it's hard to find consensus. I would go back to your earlier question about how easy is it to write code against all of these different regulations. So one of the problems with making banking technology is that as a programmer, you want to write once and run anywhere. But if we have 50 different states with different rules individually, and the computer is considered to be in cyberspace, well, I could just shrug and say, oh, well, it's in cyberspace, it doesn't matter. Or I could say I need the rules to adhere to the rules of the real world. So these are individual decisions, and I think that's one of the cultural differences between computer scientists and regulators.
Thank you. I yield back.
And thank you. And members are advised that votes have been called. Timer is currently at 6 minutes and 25 seconds. And so the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who's also the chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to roll three questions into one because of the votes. And my favorite time of the year is October because of Halloween and all of the movies, horror movies that come on. I know probably all of you are watching them at night with me. And I'm on Homeland Security as well, and then I chair the Subcommittee on National Security. So I don't know if I'm being troglodytic in my thinking, but a lot of this scares me more than Dracula does. Dracula's real. I just want to make sure you know that. But you know, we've got this plan, this financial plan to create a financial ecosystem by Facebook. They're calling it a stable coin. I call it scary. You know, on Homeland Security, we're always looking at what you said, Mr. Broussard. What can go wrong? What can happen? So I'm thinking power lines, water treatment facilities, and then on top of that, human error. And we have a situation that is quite threatening, and we know for a fact that the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians are daily messing with us. And you probably know about some of them. A lot of them you don't know about. Tell me it's going to be okay, or tell me it's not.
I think, all these discussions and some of the lack of clarity around liability, if we just focused on what is the precious asset here, it's the data. And if we look at the pull of what the banks are worried about, it's the data privacy, the data security. And regardless of what happens, if there is a breach, if there is a vulnerability in the hardware or the physical location, if the data itself is protected, then we're good. There's other bad things that can happen, of course, interruption of service, but at least people's data and their privacy are secured in that. So if we just focus on the life cycle of the data security itself, then it helps to, I think, simplify a lot of these questions that we're having.
And Representative, I agree with your point that the threat landscape is extremely broad, but one of the things that we have to recognize is we can't put a priority on the most important thing to worry about is energy or water or our financial system, because if any one of those systems had a major cyber breach, it would be catastrophic, which is why we need to really have a comprehensive cyber defense approach across all of our critical systems.
But we're not even close to that, are we?
No, we're not.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be then forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Thank you, and this task force hearing is adjourned.